They thought it was just a photo, one last family portrait beside a coffin on a cold November morning in 1891. But when the film developed, something impossible stared back at them. There, standing among the mourners, was a man who wasn't supposed to be there, a face everyone recognized, yet one they had buried the week before. His expression was twisted, almost smiling, and his hand rested on the shoulder of the woman he had murdered. That single photograph, taken in a quiet Kansas farmhouse, would go on to haunt generations, not just because of what it revealed, but because it refused to stay still. Each time someone looked at it, the figures seemed to move, shifting closer together, as though the dead were gathering again. This is the story of the 1891 family funeral photo that revealed the murderer, a tale of grief, guilt, and a picture that remembered far too much. The year was 1891, and the town of Elders Hollow lay quiet beneath a pale gray sky. The frost had come early that winter, hardening the dirt roads and silencing even the crows. News traveled slowly there, carried on wagon wheels and whispers, but death always arrived right on time. That week, it had come for the Merriman family. Neighbors gathered at their farmhouse, standing in the cold as the coffin of Matthias Merriman, the family patriarch, was carried from the parlor to the yard for the traditional funeral photograph. It was a custom, strange by modern eyes, ordinary back then, to capture the family one last time together, the living and the dead. The photographer, Samuel Rook, arrived from the next town over with his heavy camera and glass plates, his breath rising in faint clouds. He'd done this before, dozens of times, but he would later swear that something about this session made his hands tremble. Inside, the family arranged themselves stiffly. The widow, Martha, pale and trembling. The sons, Eli and Thomas, faces like carved wood, and the daughter, Clara, her eyes swollen from crying. Samuel positioned the camera. The ticking of his pocket watched the only sound. "Hold still," he murmured. The shutter opened, a brief flash of eternity. None of them could have known then that this single photograph, once developed, would expose a truth far darker than death itself. 2 days later, as the plate soaked in its chemical bath in Samuel's darkroom, something impossible began to take shape. He leaned closer, the image of the Merrimans emerging, gray faces beneath a white shroud of mist. At first, everything looked as expected: the coffin, the mourning clothes, the stiff Victorian poses. But then Samuel saw it, a face that should not have been there. It appeared in the back corner of the parlor, behind the curtains, half-shadowed, watching. It wasn't a trick of exposure or a double print. The figure was clear, defined, human. And yet, no one had been standing there. Samuel wiped his eyes, checked his lens, his chemicals, even the glass. But the figure remained. A man, his features sharp, his gaze fixed not on the camera, but on Martha Merriman. The longer Samuel stared, the more a sick weight filled his chest. He recognized the face. It was Henry Pike, the Merriman's neighbor, and the same man who, according to gossip in Elders Hollow, had quarreled violently with Matthias just a week before the patriarch's sudden illness. Samuel locked the studio door, his heart thundering. The photograph still dripped with silver nitrate, but he already knew it would change everything. Somewhere inside that frozen moment, in the eyes of the living, the dead, and the unseen watcher, the truth had been captured forever. By dawn the next morning, Samuel Rook hadn't slept. The photograph sat drying by the window, its silver-gray surface gleaming faintly in the morning light. He kept glancing at it, unable to shake the feeling that he'd caught something he shouldn't have, like a hunter snaring a ghost instead of prey. The figure behind the curtain hadn't blurred or faded with the drying process. If anything, it seemed sharper now, more defined, as though the man in the photo had grown bolder overnight. Samuel debated whether to bring it to the Merrimans, but a heavy dread kept him frozen. He knew what people in Elders Hollow said about seeing things that weren't meant to be seen. The last man who claimed to capture a spirit in a photograph left town under threat of being burned as a heretic. Still, curiosity, or guilt, gnawed at him. By noon, he hitched his horse and carried the photograph, carefully wrapped, to the Merriman home. The air smelled of smoke and winter earth. When Martha answered the door, her eyes were hollow, her mourning dress creased from sleepless nights. Samuel hesitated before speaking. "Mrs. Merriman," he said softly, "the photograph's ready. But there's something you should see." She took it from him, her trembling fingers brushing the paper. For a moment, she stared silently. Then her face changed. Her lips parted, a gasp, barely audible, and she dropped the photograph onto the floorboards. Martha's voice was a whisper, but the weight of her words chilled the air. "That's Henry Pike," she said, pointing at the shadowed figure behind the curtain. Her hand shook as she clutched her chest. "He was here that day. I heard the boards creak, but I thought it was Eli." Samuel knelt to retrieve the print, his own reflection warped across its glossy surface. Henry Pike, the man everyone knew to be jealous of Matthias's land and Martha's quiet kindness. He'd come by the house many times under the pretense of helping with farm work, and rumor had it that he and Matthias had argued over a boundary fence. Yet when Matthias had fallen ill and died within days, no one dared speak of foul play. In towns like Elders Hollow, people feared God's wrath more than man's justice. Now, the photograph told a story no one could deny. Samuel and Martha stared at the image as if expecting it to move again. Outside, the wind howled through the naked trees, making the house groan. "It's not possible," Samuel muttered, half to himself. "I was watching the room the entire time." Martha's eyes filled with tears. "Then he was hiding," she said. "Watching us. Watching me." The photograph lay between them, cold proof that death had not been the only presence in that room. And as the day darkened, both realized that what was captured was not just memory, but evidence. By the time the sun sank behind the leafless trees, word of the photograph had spread through Elders Hollow like wildfire. In a town where everyone knew everyone else's sins, secrets didn't stay buried long. A few neighbors came by under the guise of checking on Martha, but their true purpose was curiosity, the morbid need to witness what had been captured on glass and paper. They gathered around Samuel's print, their breaths clouding in the cold parlor air, eyes darting from the casket to the shadow in the curtain. Someone whispered Henry Pike's name, and another crossed herself. "That's the devil's work," an old man muttered, refusing to look twice. But one by one, those who did look began to see something more. The figure wasn't just standing still. His face, that grainy blur of features, seemed to twist slightly with every glance, the faintest turn of the head, the subtlest shift in his eyes. Samuel swore it was a trick of the light, the uneven exposure. Yet each person described the same thing. The man was watching them. A girl screamed, claiming she saw him smile. Another neighbor swore she saw movement in the background when no one else did. The room grew tense, air heavy with the sound of cracking wood and whispering wind. Martha clutched her shawl tight, trembling. "He shouldn't be here," she murmured, voice thin. "Matthias wouldn't rest while he still walks free." Samuel wrapped the photograph again, his hands slick with sweat. That night, he placed it in his trunk, but when he woke near dawn, the print lay on the floor beside his bed, face up, staring at him. Sleep became a stranger to Samuel Rook. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the photograph, the pale coffin, the curtain, the figure. At first, he thought his mind was playing tricks, but then came the sound. A soft click, like the shutter of his camera, echoing faintly in his dreams. Then another. It grew so real he awoke once to find his camera's mechanism open, its lens pointed toward the bed. He tried to convince himself it was coincidence, that maybe he had forgotten to close it. But the unease gnawed at him, crawling under his skin like frostbite. Meanwhile, Martha became a ghost of herself. She stopped attending church, stopped opening her curtains. People said she was haunted by guilt, that she must have known more about her husband's death than she'd let on. Others claimed Henry Pike had disappeared from town, taking his wagon and horses into the hills. But Samuel knew the truth no one else would admit aloud. The man in the photograph hadn't just been seen. He was still there. The last time Samuel tried to burn the image, the paper blackened and curled, but the figure's shape refused to vanish. It stayed, etched like a scar in silver nitrate. And as the flames dimmed, Samuel swore he saw the figure's eyes catch the firelight, alive, aware, and fixed on him. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came 3 nights later. Elders Hollow had fallen into an early winter hush. No moon, only the faint glimmer of frost over fields. Samuel sat alone in his studio, oil lamp flickering, the photograph of the funeral still sealed in its envelope on the workbench. The silence was thick enough to hear his heartbeat, until a soft tapping echoed from the glass plate cabinet. Tap, tap, tap. At first, he thought it was just the wood contracting in the cold, but then the rhythm changed, slow, deliberate, human. He turned, the lamplight trembling in his hand, and the cabinet door creaked open on its own. Inside, the glass negatives shimmered faintly, one by one, until the funeral plate slid forward, stopping at the edge like it wanted to be seen. Samuel's breath caught. He reached out with shaking fingers and lifted it by the edges. There, faint, ghostly white, was the outline of the 6th figure again, clearer now than before. And this time, it wasn't standing behind the curtain. It was closer, hovering near the casket, its face half-formed, as though stepping into existence. He dropped the plate. It shattered, but instead of silence, a distant echo filled the room, like someone breathing just behind him. When he turned, the lamp went out, plunging him into the dark. The only light came from the silver gleam of broken glass at his feet, and in its reflection, he swore he saw a pair of eyes blink back at him. The next morning, Samuel found the broken plate whole again, reassembled neatly on the workbench. He staggered back, unable to understand what he was seeing. The cracks were gone, the glass cold to the touch, as though it had never been broken. But something had changed. The 6th figure now faced the camera directly, its mouth slightly open, revealing just the hint of teeth. That same day, news spread that Martha's barn had burned to the ground overnight. No lightning, no lamp left unattended. It had simply gone up in flames. The townsfolk gathered in whispers, saying it was the devil's punishment, that Matthias's soul had finally risen to take revenge. When Samuel tried to comfort Martha, she only stared at him with empty eyes. "He's coming for everyone in that photo," she said softly. "And you took it." The words dug into him like frostbite. Later that night, Samuel went to his studio again, desperate to destroy the image once and for all. But as he lit the fire, the photo slipped from his hands, fluttering midair before landing gently on the table. He froze. The edges curled inward, smoke rising, but the center remained untouched. The 6th figure grew darker, more defined. Then came the sound again, a camera shutter, but not his own. Click, click, click. And in the faint reflection of the window, Samuel saw himself, standing behind his own body, smiling faintly, as if the 6th figure had finally found its new host. By the following week, Elders Hollow had turned restless. The townsfolk no longer met each other's eyes in the marketplace. Mothers kept their children indoors. Men who had stood beside the coffin in the photo started falling ill, one by one. The blacksmith, a sturdy man with hands like iron, was found sitting upright in his chair, eyes wide open, pupils milky white. No wound, no struggle, just gone. The only thing out of place was a faint streak of soot beneath his fingernails, the same gray dust that clung to Samuel's camera lenses. Then came Clara Hensley, the schoolteacher. She'd been seen talking to Martha that morning, but by dusk her home smelled of iron and candle smoke. When the sheriff broke in, Clara's mirror was cracked from top to bottom, and written across it, in something dark and sticky, were the words, "He's in the glass." Samuel tried to tell himself it was coincidence, fever, panic, but deep down, the truth gnawed at him. He saw the same soot under his own nails. He stopped sleeping. He locked his studio, covered every mirror in his home, and kept the cursed photograph wrapped in burlap inside a chest under the floorboards. Yet still, at night, he heard the faint sound of a camera shutter, not outside, but inside the walls. It came from the chest. Sometimes it came from his own reflection. By the 3rd death, Samuel was no longer denying it. The photograph had become a living thing, feeding on grief and guilt, stretching invisible fingers through every shadow of Elder's Hollow. He tried burning it again, but the flames refused to touch it. He buried it by the creek, only to find it lying on his doorstep the next morning, dry, clean, unburned. Each time it returned, the sixth figure grew clearer, almost human now, the faint trace of a smile curling where its mouth had been. Martha came to see him that night, her face pale as bone. She said she'd seen Matthias walking near the old churchyard, wearing the same coat he was buried in. "He's not gone," she whispered. "He's waiting for us to join the picture." Samuel wanted to believe she'd lost her mind, until she handed him a small photo she'd found tucked under her door. It was the funeral photo again, only now there were 7 figures. He counted them twice, each face clearer than the last, and one of them was unmistakably his. His own reflection staring back, eyes dull and lifeless, mouth frozen mid-breath. That night, he dreamt of the camera clicking endlessly, taking pictures even in the dark. When he woke, his window pane bore a single handprint, small, childlike, pressed from inside the glass. By the next morning, the town had turned against Samuel entirely. Rumors spread faster than wildfire through the wheat fields of Elder's Hollow. Whispers that the photographer had stolen something sacred, that his camera had trapped not just images but souls. The pastor warned people from the pulpit that the devil hides in the glass. No one looked Samuel in the eyes anymore. When he walked through the square, mothers pulled their children aside, and men spat into the dirt as he passed. Even his landlord left a note on the door, saying the room was no longer his to rent. But Samuel didn't care about them anymore. The only thing he feared now was sleep, because when he slept, the camera took pictures on its own. He could hear it, the soft click, click, echoing in the corners of his mind, and every time he woke, another photograph would be lying on his table, ones he never remembered taking. In the photos, the town looked emptier each time. Buildings faded. Trees leaned as if straining away from something unseen. And in the background of every image, that sixth figure drew closer. Sometimes just a silhouette near a fence post, other times a faint shadow peering from a window. But last night, when he developed the latest print, his own home was gone entirely. Only the empty field remained, with a dark figure standing where his door should have been. Samuel didn't know whether to scream or pray. Martha came again that night, her voice trembling as she told Samuel what everyone else was whispering, that the graves of the Hensley family had been disturbed. Dirt clawed up from the inside. The baby's tiny coffin cracked open like an egg. There were handprints on the lid, not small ones, but larger, like those of a grown man. Samuel's stomach turned. He couldn't tell if he was still awake or already living inside the nightmare that photo had become. He showed Martha the new image, and she recoiled instantly, covering her mouth. That's my house," she whispered. "But I wasn't there yesterday." Samuel looked closer. There she was, Martha, standing at her window, face pale, mouth open in a silent cry. Behind her, the sixth figure loomed, its form sharper than ever, its hands resting on her shoulders. But the most terrifying part wasn't what he saw. It was that her reflection in the window was smiling. That night, Martha disappeared. The next morning, Samuel found another photo on his table. This time, it was just her house. Empty. By the following week, Elder's Hollow had become a town of locked doors and whispered prayers. The fields, once golden, now lay gray beneath the weight of constant fog that rolled in from nowhere. It was as if the land itself had begun to mourn. The sheriff, a broad man named Ellison Granger, came knocking on Samuel's door at dawn, demanding to know what he'd done to Martha. Samuel could barely speak. His hands trembled too violently. Instead, he showed the sheriff the photographs. Granger stared at them for a long time without saying a word. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, cautious. "You took these in your own home?" Samuel nodded. "Then why," the sheriff asked, "am I standing in the background of this one?" Samuel's breath caught. He hadn't noticed before, but there, behind the sheriff's shoulder in one of the older prints, was Ellison himself. Only his face was blurred, and his eyes were turned towards something unseen outside the frame. The sheriff stepped back, muttering a prayer under his breath. He ordered Samuel to stop developing anything further and to hand over his equipment. But Samuel refused. "You don't understand," he whispered, gripping the camera like it was his heartbeat. "It isn't mine anymore." Samuel looked closer. There she was, Martha, standing at her window, face pale, mouth open in a silent cry. Behind her, the sixth figure loomed, its form sharper than ever, its hands resting on her shoulders. But the most terrifying part wasn't what he saw. It was that her reflection in the window was smiling. That night, Martha disappeared. The next morning, Samuel found another photo on his table. This time, it was just her house. Empty. That night, the sheriff never made it home. His horse returned without him, reins dragging through the dirt, eyes wild. When they searched for him the next day, all they found was his badge, half buried near the old Hensley barn, where the first photo had been taken. Samuel knew, somehow, that the camera had claimed another. He burned every photograph in his darkroom until his eyes stung from the smoke, but it didn't help. The prints wouldn't burn right. The fire hissed and sputtered, as if repelled by something cold. And when the ashes settled, the images were still there, faint outlines forming again, darker than before. He collapsed in despair, and for the first time since it began, he cried. The sound echoed through the empty room until another voice joined it. Soft, familiar. Martha. He turned slowly toward the door, and she stood there, pale, soaked in the same gray mist that haunted the fields. But her eyes weren't hers anymore. They glowed faintly, almost metallic, like the reflection from a lens. "Samuel," she said gently, "why did you take the picture?" Samuel's breath came in shallow gasps as he stared at the apparition before him. Martha looked exactly as she had the night she vanished, except her skin shimmered faintly, like paper catching the light. He tried to move, but the weight of dread pinned him where he stood. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, his voice breaking. Martha tilted her head slightly, eyes still glinting like two camera lenses. "Neither should you," she murmured. "You brought it back." Samuel shook his head, clutching the camera tightly. "Brought what back?" he asked. But she only smiled, that soft, maternal smile that once meant safety, and raised her hand to point toward the darkroom door. He followed her gesture, and from the gap beneath the door, a faint red glow pulsed like a heartbeat. The smell of chemicals had changed, sour, metallic, almost like blood. With trembling fingers, Samuel opened the door. The photographs he thought he'd burned now hung neatly from their wires again, untouched by flame. Only now, every image had changed. The family stood as before, Samuel, Martha, the children, but the background was no longer their home. It was black, endless, and behind them all, faint but undeniable, stood a sixth figure, taller now, clearer, a face without eyes. Samuel stumbled backward, knocking over trays of developer and silver nitrate. The liquid spread across the floor, reflecting the images as if the photos were alive within it. Martha's voice came from behind him again, closer, colder. "It only needed one of us," she whispered. "Now it has you." He turned, but she was gone. In her place lay the sheriff's badge, wet and shining, though he had never brought it inside. He reached for it, but the moment his fingers touched the metal, something shifted in the photographs. Every face turned toward him. A faint scratching filled the air, like nails against glass. The sound came from inside the camera. Samuel lifted it with shaking hands and looked through the viewfinder. What he saw was not the room. It was the field outside, under a heavy gray sky. In the center of the field stood the sixth figure, closer than ever, holding something. It was his family portrait. The figure raised it slowly, and though it had no mouth, Samuel heard the words inside his skull. "Smile for me." The camera clicked once on its own, and for the first time, Samuel felt his heartbeat stop. Days passed before anyone realized Samuel was gone. His shop stood locked, its windows blacked out from the inside. When the sheriff's deputy finally forced the door open, he found the camera on the floor, still warm, though the coals in the stove were long dead. The scent inside the darkroom was unbearable, thick with chemicals and something that reminded him of decay. Every wall was covered in photographs, hundreds of them, each showing the same family, the same farmhouse, and the same sixth figure, sometimes standing behind them, sometimes beside, sometimes in the doorway like it belonged there all along. In the center of the room, a single undeveloped photograph lay in a tray of fluid. The deputy lifted it, careful not to smear the image, but the liquid ran down his wrist like cold sweat. When the image began to emerge, he staggered backward. The photo showed Samuel, sitting at his desk, eyes wide open, mouth parted as if mid-scream. But what froze him wasn't Samuel's face. It was the thing standing behind him. Its hands rested on Samuel's shoulders, its body stretching impossibly long, fading into static like the edges of a broken glass plate. The deputy dropped the photo. It landed face up on the wet floor, and though it should have blurred, Samuel's eyes seemed to move, just slightly, as if following the deputy out the door. Word spread quickly through the small Kansas town. They said the last man to see Samuel alive was the pastor, who claimed he'd heard Samuel muttering about faces that blink in silver. The townsfolk gathered outside his shop that night, whispering beneath gas lamps. Curiosity won over fear, and one of the men, a blacksmith named Harold, decided to see for himself. He walked inside and took the final photo from the floor, holding it to the lamplight. What he saw made him drop it, but before it hit the ground, he swore he heard the faintest shutter click, though the camera was nowhere near him. By morning, Harold was found outside his forge, eyes open, mouth frozen mid-word. His family said he hadn't slept, kept muttering that the thing in the picture was standing at his window. When they searched his home, they found the photograph lying on his workbench, but now it had changed. Samuel was gone from it. The only figure that remained was the tall, eyeless shape, and it seemed to be looking right at whoever held the picture. No one touched it again. The sheriff ordered the shop sealed. But by then, a dozen other townsfolk claimed they'd seen that same pale figure, standing in their mirrors or appearing in family photos that had been hanging for years. By the time autumn crept across the plains, the photograph had become a whisper that the entire town pretended not to hear. The sheriff locked Samuel's shop, nailed the door shut, and told everyone to forget what they saw. But forgetting was impossible, because the image began to appear where it shouldn't. The pastor's wife swore she saw the same tall figure in a Sunday service photo, standing behind the choir. The local newspaper published a group portrait of farmers at the harvest fair, and there, barely visible near the edge, was that same pale shape, as though it had been standing there all along. People started burning their photographs. They smashed their frames, tore up their albums, and swore off cameras entirely. But the more they destroyed, the more new images surfaced, not taken by anyone, but found. A mother would open her kitchen drawer and discover a photo she never owned. Her own family, standing still, eyes glassy, and in the background the figure. The town's children whispered about the watcher in the picture. A story passed from one sleepover to the next. And yet, every time someone tried to describe it, the words came out wrong, as if their tongues refused to shape what their minds remembered. It was tall, yes. Pale, yes. But beyond that, the details slid away like oil on water. It was something that could only exist when you weren't looking directly at it. Soon, even the most rational among them began to break. The schoolteacher, Miss Garrison, was found sitting in her classroom long after the children had gone home, staring at an old class photo. When asked what she was doing, she said she was counting the students, but each time she did, the number changed. Some nights there were 24, other nights 25. One evening, she swore she saw one of the faces blink. The next morning, she packed her bags and left town without a word. The few remaining residents who stayed began covering their mirrors with cloth. They said reflections were just as dangerous, that once the sixth figure appeared, it would never leave. Letters sent to neighboring towns went unanswered, as if the place itself had been erased from memory. The final newspaper ever printed there had a single headline: "Photographers curse blamed for disappearances." But there was no photograph on the front page, only a blank space where one should have been. Years later, when scavengers came through the ruins of that forgotten Kansas town, they found dozens of undeveloped film plates scattered on the floor. Most were too damaged to restore. But one image survived, and when it was brought to light, it showed 5 townsfolk standing together, and one more shape, slightly behind them, smiling faintly, as though it had been waiting all along. It was nearly 70 years later when the town's name was spoken again, not by locals, for there were none left, but by a young historian named Clara Whitmore. She had a fascination with lost American towns, the ones swallowed by dust and silence. When she stumbled across a box of cracked glass negatives at a Kansas estate sale, she thought she had struck gold for her research. Each plate was labeled in neat, faded script, Bramwell, 1891. No record of such a town existed on any map. Intrigued, Clara bought the box and brought it home, setting up her small darkroom in the attic. The first few photographs revealed what she expected: families in stiff poses, women with parasols, men with heavy mustaches and hollow eyes. But then, as she moved to the later plates, she noticed something odd. In nearly every photo, the composition was perfect, symmetrical, deliberate. Yet in the far background of each, just barely in focus, there was something. Not a person exactly, but a vertical smear of white, like motion caught mid-blink. She assumed it was damage from age or exposure. But when she leaned closer, the outline sharpened. It looked like a man, no, a figure, standing just behind the subjects, head tilted as if observing the photographer. The temperature in the attic dropped. Her hands trembled, but she brushed it off as excitement. After all, she was touching a piece of forgotten history. She didn't know that this same thrill had once possessed Samuel Reed. The man who took those very photographs. It was nearly 70 years later when the town's name was spoken again, not by locals, for there were none left, but by a young historian named Clara Whitmore. She had a fascination with lost American towns, the ones swallowed by dust and silence. When she stumbled across a box of cracked glass negatives at a Kansas estate sale, she thought she had struck gold for her research. Each plate was labeled in neat, faded script, Bramwell, 1891. No record of such a town. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. The images kept replaying in her mind. The strange symmetry, the pale smudge that seemed to hover behind every family. By morning, she decided to digitize one of the negatives, hoping a modern scan would reveal the artifact for what it was. When the image appeared on her computer screen, however, something was different. The blur was gone. In its place stood a clear figure, a man in old, tattered clothes, his face partially obscured by shadow. His posture was unnatural, almost too still, like he had been holding his breath for the camera. Clara's first thought was that someone had tampered with the plate long ago, perhaps as a prank. But then she noticed his eyes. They weren't looking at the camera. They were looking at her, directly through the screen, straight into her reflection on the glass. She jerked back, her chair scraping the floor. When she leaned forward again, the monitor flickered just once, and for a moment, her own reflection was gone, replaced by 6 figures standing in the digital static. She unplugged the computer, heart pounding. But even as the room went dark, the faint afterimage of the 6th figure remained imprinted behind her eyelids, as though she had looked too long into something that had been waiting decades to be seen again. For 2 days, Clara tried to rationalize what she'd seen. Old emulsion, double exposure, her imagination, anything but something supernatural. Yet, she couldn't ignore the compulsion gnawing at her curiosity. When she finally gathered the courage to inspect the remaining negatives, one caught her attention immediately. Unlike the others, it bore an inscription etched right into the glass: the family of 6. The handwriting matched Samuel Reed's from the old Bramwell church records she'd found online. But according to those records, the Reed family had consisted of only 5 members: Samuel, his wife Eliza, and their 3 children. The handwriting trembled slightly, as though carved in haste or fear. When she held the negative to the light, the faint outline of 6 silhouettes shimmered against the pale glass. The 6th figure, barely visible, seemed to linger behind the family, its head bowed, hands clasped. What unnerved her most was the posture, not threatening, but mournful, almost reverent. She wondered if Samuel had used long exposure and accidentally captured movement. But when she measured the shadows, they didn't align. The light struck the sixth figure from a different angle entirely, as if it had been standing somewhere else, in another time, another world. That night, Clara combed through public archives, desperate for any trace of Samuel Reed beyond 1891. What she found was a single article from a Kansas paper, dated November 12th of that year. Local photographer found dead in his studio. Police described scene as inexplicable. All negatives destroyed save one. Her pulse quickened. The one saved negative had to be the one she now possessed. Clara's attic grew colder the deeper she read. The article went on to describe how Reed's studio had been discovered after neighbors heard a crash late one night. Inside, his camera stood smashed against the wall, the tripod still upright, the lens pointed at the far corner, where investigators said they found nothing but burn marks on the floorboards. The police concluded it was an accident, the result of faulty chemicals, but an unnamed witness had claimed otherwise. The woman, a seamstress from the town, said she saw a man in black standing at Reed's window moments before the noise. When she called out, the man turned, and his face was like the ash of the dead. Clara shuddered. The phrase "the ash of the dead" stuck in her mind. It was oddly poetic, eerily similar to something she had read once in one of Reed's handwritten captions. They stand where the ash of the dead once fell. She stared at the attic window, half expecting to see movement in the reflection. Instead, she noticed something else, on the glass of the negative itself. A fingerprint. She hadn't touched that side. And worse, it wasn't her size. It was smaller, thinner, like the hand of a child pressing from the inside. When she leaned in to wipe it away, she saw, for the briefest instant, the shadow of 6 small figures standing in the reflected light behind her. By dawn, Clara had made up her mind. She couldn't stop now, not after uncovering what felt like a century-old secret begging to be understood. Through scattered county records and fragments of newspaper archives, she traced the old Reed property to a small, forgotten stretch of farmland just outside Baxter Springs, Kansas. The coordinates led her to what locals called the burnt place, a crumbling foundation half swallowed by prairie grass and silence. When she arrived, mist clung low over the ground, and the skeletal remains of what once might have been Samuel Reed's studio jutted up like ribs from the earth. She parked her truck nearby and carried her tripod, camera, and a lantern through the dense fog. The morning sun was weak, filtered through cloud and decay, and it cast a gray wash over everything. Clara felt a strange reverence, as if walking through a memorial rather than a ruin. She found what must have been the north-facing window of the old studio and set up her equipment precisely where Reed's had once stood. She wanted to see what he saw, capture what he captured. But when she aimed her lens, she noticed the oddest thing. Even though the place was deserted, the viewfinder showed movement, faint ripples in the light, as if someone had just walked past. At first, she thought it was a trick of the fog. But then, the shape formed, blurry, human. A woman's silhouette in old-fashioned dress, standing in the far field, looking toward her. The air grew heavier. Her lantern flickered once, twice, then went out completely. Clara steadied her breath. "It's just my mind," she whispered, though her voice trembled. The camera's display remained active, its faint digital hum the only sound. On impulse, she pressed the shutter. The soft click broke the stillness. Nothing moved. She took another, and another. Then she lowered the camera and looked toward the field again. The woman was gone. When she checked the images, her stomach tightened. In the first shot, the field was empty. In the second, a figure appeared, indistinct but present. And in the third, she wasn't alone. 5 more silhouettes had materialized around the woman, small, childlike. Together, they faced the camera, their outlines sharper than should have been possible in such dim light. Her hands shook as she scrolled to the next photo, but the screen froze, then went black. From somewhere behind her came the faintest sound, a child's laugh. Not playful, hollow, distant, yet near enough to make the hair on her neck rise. She spun around. Nothing. Just the sagging remains of the studio, the slow moan of wood shifting under time's weight. Then came another sound. This time, It wasn't laughter but a whisper carried through the mist, faint, trembling, and impossibly clear. Take another. Her fingers froze on the shutter. Her breath came in shallow bursts as she raised the camera again, knuckles whitening around the body of the device. The fog had thickened, wrapping the old foundation in a strange, muffled silence. The whisper echoed once more, quieter now, but insistent. Take another. Clara's pulse hammered in her ears. With trembling fingers, she adjusted her focus, the glass lens glinting faintly in the dim gray light. Then she pressed the shutter. The sound that followed wasn't just the familiar click, it was layered, doubled, as though two cameras had fired at once. The display flickered, showing static for a moment before freezing on an image that shouldn't have been possible. There she was, standing exactly where she stood now. Only behind her, a group of figures filled the frame. Not ghosts, not shadows, but people, dressed in late 1800s clothing, their faces solemn, their eyes fixed on her. At the center stood a man in a dark suit, tall and severe. His expression was blank, but his right hand, pale and rigid, rested on the shoulder of a woman clutching a small, bundled infant. Clara's eyes widened. The baby's face was turned toward her camera, its eyes open, glassy. She recognized them instantly, from the photograph she had studied for weeks. The same eyes from 1891. The same child. The same family. She staggered backward, tripping over a half-buried beam. The camera slipped from her grasp, but didn't hit the ground. Something, or someone, caught it midair and held it upright. The shutter clicked again. When Clara lunged forward to grab the camera, the display lit up once more. This time, it showed her own face, frozen in mid-scream. The background of the image was darker than before, the ruined studio no longer visible. Instead, behind her stood the same family, now arranged in perfect symmetry. The man, the woman, the infant, and just behind them, another figure had appeared. It was Samuel Reed. His gaunt features were unmistakable from the self-portrait she'd found in the archives, his expression that of a man caught between guilt and madness. But something was different. In the photograph, his eyes weren't on the family. They were on Clara, watching her, waiting. Her throat tightened as the lantern beside her reignited on its own, flickering violently. The fog seemed to pulse with each tremor of the flame. Then she noticed something else, faint shapes forming within the mist around her, echoing the figures from the photo. The same silhouettes, the same positioning. It was as if the photograph had bled into reality, the boundary between the captured and the living dissolving into air. A voice, deep, strained, and distorted, rose from the static hum of the camera. "Finish it," it said. "The murderer must be shown." The words seemed to vibrate through her bones. And as she turned the camera toward the empty field, she saw him, a lone figure in the distance, dressed in 19th century attire, holding something that glimmered faintly in the light. It was a blade. The figure stood motionless in the haze, its outline wavering as if the fog itself struggled to contain it. Clara lifted the camera slowly, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the faint hiss of wind. Through the lens, the image sharpened. A man in an old black coat, his collar stiff and formal, his hat shadowing most of his face. The blade in his hand caught a sliver of the lantern's light, flashing for an instant before disappearing back into shadow. Every instinct screamed for her to run, but something, perhaps the same force that had drawn her here, rooted her to the ground. She zoomed in slightly, the lens focusing on his face. Her breath hitched. It wasn't Samuel Reed. The man's features were harder, crueler, the same as those of the patriarch from the original 1891 photograph. The father. Her pulse faltered. The newspaper reports had described him as grief-stricken, devastated by the loss of his youngest child. But as Clara watched, the man's expression shifted. A faint smile, almost imperceptible, curled the corner of his mouth. It wasn't sorrow. It was satisfaction. The fog parted slightly, and behind him, the ghostly figures of the mother and children became visible once more. They were not still this time. They swayed, as though the air itself tugged at them, bound by invisible strings. The woman's hands clutched the infant tighter. Clara felt cold spread through her limbs, the pieces falling together in her mind. The father hadn't mourned them. He had killed them. The 1891 photograph wasn't a memorial. It was a confession. Clara lowered the camera, trembling. She could almost hear the faint echo of that long-ago shutter click, the sound that had frozen the family forever in time. But in this moment, as reality and the past blurred together, she realized the photograph hadn't merely captured their faces, it had trapped their souls. The fog thickened again, and from its depths came a cry, high, sharp, and filled with the agony of a woman betrayed. The mother's figure surged forward, her eyes now two pale orbs of light. She hovered behind the father, reaching for him with clawed, trembling hands. The infant in her arms tilted its head unnaturally, the same eerie motion that had once made the 1891 portrait infamous, the moving eyes. Clara stumbled backward, nearly dropping her camera again. But before she could run, the voice returned. Samuel Reed's, calm but desperate. "Show it, Clara. Let them see." She raised the camera one last time, pointing it toward the apparition of the father as the ghostly family surrounded him. Her fingers shook as she pressed the shutter. The flash ignited the fog like lightning, and for a single blinding instant, the image of the murderer's face, twisted in terror, burned into her vision. Then the light vanished. The fog collapsed. The figures were gone. The only thing left was the faint smell of smoke and the soft hum of her camera. When she dared to look at the screen, her breath caught. There was only one photograph on it, perfectly framed, sepia-toned, and identical to the 1891 original, except for one difference. The father's eyes were wide open, staring straight at her. Clara stared at the photo, frozen in disbelief. The image on her camera screen seemed to hum, faintly alive, as if the pixels themselves pulsed with a heartbeat. Her reflection shimmered faintly across the glass, but even that began to distort. Her own eyes appeared darker, deeper, almost merging with the father's ghostly stare in the photograph. She blinked and the hum stopped, yet the feeling of being watched did not. The photograph wasn't just showing her something from the past. It was looking back. Her fingers trembled as she tried to turn off the camera, but the button resisted. The screen flickered once, then twice, before freezing entirely. The image now filled the display, a perfect mirror of the 1891 portrait, every detail rendered in the same aged tone. But where the family once sat rigid and posed, their faces now seemed subtly wrong. The father's head tilted slightly to one side, the corners of his lips lifting. Behind him, the mother's eyes gleamed faintly, and the infant's pupils, milky and unblinking, followed Clara wherever she moved. Her breath fogged the lens as she lowered the camera. The air in the room had grown dense, each inhale harder than the last. The silence was heavy, almost electric. Then, from behind her, she heard it, the faint creak of the floorboards. Once, twice, slow, deliberate steps, approaching from the hallway where she'd entered only minutes earlier. She turned quickly, heart pounding, but saw nothing. The door stood ajar, letting in a sliver of pale moonlight that barely reached the center of the room. When she turned back toward the camera, the display had gone black. A single word now appeared in white text across it, revealed. Panic clawed at her throat. She stumbled backward, her heel catching the edge of the rug as she crashed into a dusty chair. The camera slipped from her hand, striking the wooden floor with a dull crack. Its lens shattered, and for a moment, Clara felt an absurd sense of relief, as though breaking it might end whatever this was. But when she looked down, her relief curdled into dread. The cracked lens still glowed faintly, a spiderweb of light pulsing through it like veins. And then the sound began again. The old camera from the shelf, the original 1891 model, clicked once, its shutter snapping on its own. Clara froze. The device was nowhere near plugged in, nowhere near capable of working, but it clicked again. Click. Then again, faster. Click, click, click. Each flash from the ancient bulb illuminated fragments of the room. The peeling wallpaper, the warped mirror, the faint outline of the family portrait on the wall. Only now, there were more faces in it. Her breath caught in her throat as she stepped closer. The photograph hanging on the wall, once faded and yellowed, now shimmered with impossible clarity. The father's expression was no longer one of hidden malice. It was satisfaction. The mother and child looked peaceful. But to the right, barely visible at the edge of the frame, was a new figure. A woman, her posture stiff, her expression frozen mid-fear. Her clothes modern, her hair the same color as Clara's. Her knees weakened. The realization sank like lead. The photograph hadn't just captured her picture. It had taken her. Clara stumbled backward, her pulse roaring in her ears like thunder. The photograph on the wall seemed to breathe, its frame expanding ever so slightly, as if it were inhaling the same air as her. She blinked hard, trying to steady her vision, but the movement didn't stop. The figures in the photo, the father, mother, child, and now the woman who looked like her, shimmered faintly under the flicker of the candlelight. Their skin looked waxy, their eyes reflecting a dim, otherworldly gleam. And then, the faintest whisper slithered through the air. "Stay still." Her blood turned to ice. The voice was low, cracked with age, but distinctly human and impossibly near. She turned toward the sound, expecting to see someone behind her, but there was only the mirror. Except, the mirror no longer showed her reflection. Instead, it showed the room as it appeared inside the photo, darker, older, more decayed. The wallpaper peeled away in long, curling strips, cobwebs hung like lace. The window was nailed shut from the inside. In that reflection, Clara was standing not alone, but among them. The father's hand rested gently on her shoulder. She screamed and spun around, but the room was empty again. The photo still hung on the wall, silent and still, as if nothing had happened. She wanted to run, to burst out of the house and into the night, but something compelled her to look again. Against every instinct screaming in her chest, she stepped closer. The father's painted eyes seemed to narrow as she approached. Beneath his gaze, faint cracks spidered across the photograph's surface, splitting the image into jagged lines. Through those fractures, something beneath seemed to shift, a layer behind the picture, like movement beneath ice. And then, from within the cracks, she saw a flicker, a single human eye blinking from inside the photograph. She stumbled back in horror, her shoulders striking the doorframe. The wooden panel behind her quivered under the impact, as though something on the other side had felt it too. Her breath came in shallow bursts. The air tasted metallic, heavy with age. The eye within the photograph blinked again, slower this time, and then began to move, sliding across the image, following her as she shifted in the room. It wasn't just watching, it was tracking. "Please," she whispered, voice trembling, half to the room and half to whatever presence might hear. But the only answer was a sound from within the wall, a faint, muffled tapping, rhythmic and deliberate. Once, twice, pause, 3 times. It sounded like fingernails scraping wood. Then, something behind the wallpaper began to bulge outward, as if the wall itself was trying to breathe. Clara reached for her phone, desperate to capture what she was seeing, but the moment she opened the camera, the screen glitched violently. The live preview showed not the current room, but the photograph. There she was again, trapped inside the old portrait, her mouth frozen mid-scream. The family posed around her like proud captors. Her hands trembled. She dropped the phone. When it hit the floor, the sound of shattering glass echoed far louder than it should have. The light flickered, once, twice, and in the split second of darkness between the flickers, she wasn't alone anymore. When the light returned, Clara saw her reflection again in the mirror. But this time, she wasn't facing herself. Standing behind her, just over her shoulder, was the faint outline of a man in a dark 19th century suit. His lips curved into that same, satisfied smile she had seen in the portrait, the smile of the murderer revealed. Clara didn't dare breathe. Her reflection, her other self, didn't move in unison anymore. It watched her, head tilted at a strange angle, eyes glinting with that same distant knowledge she'd seen in the man's smirk. Then, without warning, the reflection blinked first. It turned its head toward the photograph hanging beside the mirror, and Clara, as if hypnotized, followed its gaze. Something inside her broke. She turned and sprinted toward the door, her heart hammering so loud she could barely hear her own gasps. The handle twisted beneath her grip, stiff with age, but it gave way. The door flung open, and she bolted out into the night air. Or at least, she thought it was night. The world outside didn't feel like hers anymore. The yard looked wrong. The grass was brittle, gray, as if drained of life. The air was heavy and unmoving, and where the moon should have been, a dull orange glow bled through the clouds. Every familiar landmark, the fence, the well, the shed, was there, but older, more decayed, as though decades had passed in the blink of an eye. Her car was gone. So was the road. And yet, she could hear faint laughter, the sound of a camera shutter, echoing faintly from the barn. "Stop it," she whispered, clutching her chest. Her voice barely carried. A figure stood near the fence, tall, unmoving, its head slightly bowed. At first she thought it was a scarecrow, until she saw the faint glimmer of metal in its hand, the same old-fashioned camera from the photograph. When the flash went off, the world exploded in white light. For a split second, Clara wasn't in the yard anymore. She was in the photograph, standing stiffly, her limbs heavy, her mouth frozen in a false smile. The family stood around her, their eyes empty yet fixed on her face. The father held the camera. The child's glassy eyes darted in her direction. And then the light faded, and she was back outside again, gasping, dizzy, but no longer sure where outside even was. The sky above her pulsed faintly, like a dying heartbeat. The farmhouse windows glowed with a dim light, though she knew she hadn't left any lamps burning inside. Every instinct screamed to keep running, but her legs felt slow, almost heavy, as if something were dragging at her from behind. She turned back, and in the dim light she saw it. Faint handprints appearing one by one across the ground, pressed into the soil as though invisible figures were crawling toward her. The laughter returned, louder this time. It was a mixture of children's giggles and something darker, a whispering chorus that repeated her name. The sound came from every direction, weaving through the air like a living thing. She backed away, her breath fogging in the cold, unnatural air. Her eyes darted toward the tree lean, and there, half hidden in the fog, she saw dozens of silhouettes. All motionless, all facing her. Her pulse quickened. "What do you want?" she shouted, but her voice came out broken, small against the vast emptiness. The only reply was the click of the camera again, sharp, deliberate, echoing from somewhere close. She turned toward the sound, but before she could move, she felt fingers brush the back of her neck. Cold. Human. She spun around. Nothing. But when she looked down, she realized her shadow had changed. There were two now, one slightly behind hers, taller, wearing a hat. And as the next flash erupted, the world around her bent, as though light itself was folding inward. The ground seemed to dissolve beneath her feet. And then, silence. When her vision cleared, she was no longer standing in front of the farmhouse. She was inside it again. Only this time, everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, as if 100 years had passed. The photograph still hung on the wall, but now, in the corner of the image, there was a new figure standing among the family, her own. Clara's breath came in shallow bursts as she stumbled through the decaying house. Every surface was veiled in dust, and the air carried a stagnant chill that made her skin crawl. The furniture was still there, the same wooden chairs, the same cracked piano, but time had gnawed through everything, leaving only fragments of a memory. She reached the hallway where the portrait hung. Her hands trembled as she raised the lantern, its light flickering weakly over the frame. The photograph had changed again. The family's faces were sharper now, their smiles eerily natural, too natural. The father's eyes gleamed, reflecting the lantern's glow as though alive. The child, the one whose eyes had once moved, now stared straight out of the photo, directly at Clara. And there, beside him, stood her own likeness, perfectly still, her face pale and hollow. She staggered back, while rising in her throat. No, this isn't real, but it was. Because beneath the photograph, a small brass plate had appeared, one she was certain hadn't been there before. The inscription read, "The Harper Family Funeral, March 2nd, 1891." And below that, etched in newer lettering, a final line that froze her blood. Photographed by Clara Whitfield. Her lantern slipped from her grasp and shattered against the floor. The flames sputtered, casting wild shadows across the walls. She tried to speak, to scream, but no sound came out. Her name, her own name, was carved into the relic of a century-old tragedy. The truth began to bloom in her mind like rot. She wasn't an intruder in this story, she was part of it. Somehow, impossibly, she had been drawn into the moment that birthed the photograph itself. And the family, those hollow-eyed specters, were not haunting her. They were waiting for her. From the parlor, the old camera clicked once more. Clara turned toward the sound, her pulse hammering in her ears. In the doorway stood the father, or what remained of him. His body flickered faintly, like an image half-developed. The air shimmered around him, and his voice came as a brittle whisper, echoing with static. "You came back to finish it, didn't you?" he rasped. "You promised us light, and you gave us shadow." Her throat tightened. "I don't understand." "Oh, but you do." The voice interrupted, closer now, though his mouth didn't move. "You took the photograph. You saw what shouldn't have been seen. You captured us, between life and death." Her mind reeled. Memories that weren't hers flashed behind her eyes. A cold morning in 1891, a family gathered for a funeral, a photographer adjusting her tripod, while a grieving mother begged for one final picture. The child's eyes opened for just a moment too long. The camera's flash freezing something that wasn't meant to exist. The images bled into one another until Clara could no longer tell where memory ended and nightmare began. "I didn't mean to." "Intent," the father murmured, stepping closer, his features warping like wet paint, "means nothing to the dead." The sound of a camera shutter cracked through the air again, but this time, she hadn't taken it. Her body locked. She turned her head just enough to see the source, the child holding the camera, his lips curled into the faintest smile. "Smile," he whispered, and before she could move, light consumed her. Her scream stretched thin, warping, blending into the soft hum of electricity that filled the room. When the brightness faded, only silence remained, and on the wall, the photograph had changed one final time. Now, there were 7 figures. When the light dimmed, the house was silent once more. Dust floated lazily in the air, as if time itself had stopped. The shattered lantern's flame had gone out, and the only illumination came from the pale moonlight spilling through the cracked window pane. On the wall, the photograph gleamed faintly, its surface now smoother, newer, as though freshly developed. In it, the Harper family looked serene. The father's hand rested gently on the shoulder of his youngest son. The mother's gaze was soft, her mourning dress now perfectly arranged. But there, at the far right, a new figure stood, a young woman, camera in hand, her face eerily familiar. Clara. Her expression was frozen in a faint, melancholic smile, the same one she'd seen on every victim of the curse. Her presence completed the portrait. The Harper family no longer looked incomplete. They looked content. Outside, dawn began to edge across the horizon, painting the Kansas fields in thin streaks of orange and gray. The house, unseen by anyone for decades, seemed almost peaceful. But within its walls, the air still shimmered faintly, humming with the residue of something unnatural. Weeks later, the property would be rediscovered by a group of preservationists cataloging abandoned homes. Among the decayed belongings, they'd find only one item untouched by time: a photograph framed perfectly, hanging in the parlor. Its glass was clean, its image startlingly clear. And as one volunteer leaned closer to examine it, he'd swear, just for a moment, that one of the faces in the picture moved. A blink, no more than that, but enough to make his blood run cold. When they packed up to leave that evening, he'd find something slipped inside his bag, a small brass plate, engraved with the words, "Photographed by Clara Whitfield." The photograph passed quietly into the hands of collectors, then into the archives of a small rural museum. No one could trace its precise origin. The Harpers had no surviving records, and Clara Whitfield was never found. The curator who first cataloged it wrote in his notes that the picture feels wrong somehow, too alive for the dead. Over the years, strange reports followed the photo. Archivists described hearing faint whispers while working late, soft clicks, like the shutter of an old camera. Others swore that the photograph sometimes seemed to hold one more person than they remembered. When one employee tried to take a digital scan, the image distorted, revealing pale shapes behind the family that vanished when printed. By the early 2000s, the museum quietly removed it from public display after multiple staff members complained of recurring nightmares involving a woman with a camera and a child with moving eyes. The item was labeled "Artifact Withdrawn for Preservation." It was locked away in a vault. Yet still, visitors walking near the storage wing reported hearing faint echoes, a single word, spoken in the dark. "Smile." No one knows where the photograph is now. The vault was damaged during a storm, and several items were declared missing. Among them, the Harper family funeral portrait, dated 1891. Some claim it resurfaced online years later, scanned and posted to an obscure photography forum. The post was titled, "Unedited, found in my grandfather's attic." Within hours, the account vanished. But occasionally, that same image appears again, shared, reposted, always slightly different each time. Some versions show only 6 figures. Others show 7. And if you look long enough into their eyes, especially the woman holding the camera, you might see something flicker, something that shouldn't be moving at all.